The reluctant ambassador Marcus Chen stared out the viewport of the diplomatic transport as Unity's hope grew larger against the star field. The massive space station looked like a metal flower with 8 petals, each section designed to accommodate different alien atmospheric requirements. He had read about it in briefings, but seeing it with his own eyes made the scope of these peace negotiations feel real for the first time. Impressive, isn't it? Admiral Sarah Voss settled into the seat beside him. She was a career military officer, tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a regulation knot. Her presence on this diplomatic mission spoke volumes about how seriously Earth Command was taking these talks. "It's bigger than I expected," Marcus replied, adjusting his dark suit jacket. At 38, he had handled dozens of diplomatic crises, but nothing quite like this. The Galactic War had been raging for over 2 centuries, consuming entire star systems and claiming billions of lives across 8 different species. If these negotiations failed, the conflict could spread to Earth's outer colonies. Dr. Elena Rodriguez looked up from her tablet, where she had been reviewing psychological profiles of the alien delegates. "The station was built specifically for these talks," she said. "Neutral territory with environmental controls for each species. Cost the equivalent of Earth's entire GDP for 3 years." The transport docked with a gentle bump, and Marcus felt the artificial gravity shift slightly as they transferred to the station's systems. The airlock opened to reveal a corridor that stretched beyond his line of sight, with walls that seemed to pulse with soft, organic light. Their guide was waiting for them, a synthetic being that looked vaguely humanoid but with skin that shifted through different metallic colors. "Welcome to Unity's Hope," it said in perfect English. "I am Protocol Unit 7. I will escort you to the human quarters and brief you on station procedures." As they walked through the corridors, Marcus caught glimpses of the other species through transparent sections. In one area, tall insectoid creatures with 4 arms and crystalline eyes moved in precise formations. These were the Karathi, warrior scholars whose empire controlled 37 star systems. In another section, what looked like walking trees, with bioluminescent leaves, swayed gently in a garden-like environment. The Solani Collective, plant-based beings who had achieved consciousness through symbiotic relationships with fungal networks. "How long have the current negotiations been going on?" Marcus asked Protocol Unit 7. 6 months, 14 days, 7 hours, came the immediate reply. "This represents the longest continuous diplomatic session in recorded galactic history." Marcus and Admiral Voss exchanged glances. 6 months with no progress was not a good sign. Dr. Rodriguez was already making notes on her tablet about the time frame. The human quarters were modest but comfortable. 3 interconnected rooms with Earth-normal atmosphere and artificial windows showing real-time views of space. Marcus dropped his travel bag on the bed and immediately pulled out his briefing materials. Earth's position was straightforward. They wanted an end to the fighting that would allow human colonies to trade freely without fear of being caught in alien conflicts. "We need to understand why these talks have gone on so long without results," Admiral Voss said, settling into a chair with her own stack of reports. "Either the issues are incredibly complex, or someone doesn't actually want peace." Dr. Rodriguez was connecting her tablet to the station's information network. "I'm pulling up the session transcripts from the past 6 months. Maybe we can identify patterns in the negotiation breakdowns." Marcus spent the next 3 hours reading through diplomatic exchanges that made his head spin. The Karathi Empire demanded exclusive mining rights to 17 disputed systems. The Draconi Federation claimed ancient territorial boundaries that would give them control over major trade routes. The Ethereal Communion wanted protection for their crystal-based life forms, which several other species considered valuable resources rather than sentient beings. Every proposal was met with immediate rejection. Every compromise suggestion was dismissed as unacceptable. Every attempt at finding middle ground resulted in threats to withdraw from the talks entirely. "This is strange," Dr. Rodriguez said, looking up from her analysis. "The language patterns are too rigid. Each species is using almost identical phrasing from session to session, like they're reading from prepared scripts." Admiral Voss leaned over to look at the data. "What do you mean?" "Look at this," Elena pointed to her screen. The Karathi representative uses the exact same words to reject trade proposals every single time. The honor of the Karathi Empire cannot be compromised by inferior economic arrangements. Exactly the same phrasing, down to the specific adjectives. Marcus set down his own reports and walked over to examine Elena's findings. She was right. The diplomatic language was too polished, too consistent. Real negotiations involved emotional responses, varied wording, moments of genuine frustration or hope. This looked more like a performance than actual diplomacy. "Pull up the proposals that each side has made," he said. "Let's see if there are any that could actually work if people were willing to compromise." Elena's fingers flew over her tablet, pulling up proposal documents from all 8 species. Marcus read through them with growing amazement. Several of the proposals were actually quite reasonable. The Silani Collective had suggested a rotating system for disputed territories that would give each species access during different time periods. The Ethereal Communion had offered to share their energy technology in exchange for protection of crystal sanctuaries. "These aren't impossible demands," Marcus said slowly. "Some of these proposals could form the basis for real agreements, so why haven't they been seriously discussed?" Admiral Voss was reading over his shoulder. "Because every time a reasonable proposal comes up, someone makes an unreasonable counter-demand that kills the discussion. Look at this pattern. The Silani suggest territory sharing, then the Draconi immediately demand exclusive control over 3 additional systems. The Ethereals offer technology sharing, then the Karathi insist on military alliance terms that would make the Ethereals vassals." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. It's like they're deliberately sabotaging any chance of progress. Dr. Rodriguez was running statistical analysis on her tablet. "Marcus, you need to see this. I've been tracking the timing of proposal rejections. They follow a pattern that's mathematically impossible to be coincidental. Every time negotiations show genuine promise, a specific sequence of interruptions occurs that derails the process." She showed them a timeline of the past 6 months. Negotiations. Green markers indicated moments when real progress seemed possible. Red markers showed disruptions that ended productive discussions. The pattern was clear. Every green marker was followed within hours by a red marker. "Someone is orchestrating these failures," Marcus said, "but who?" Their discussion was interrupted by a soft chime from the room's communication system. "Attention, human delegation," came Protocol Unit 7's voice. "Evening meal service begins in 30 minutes. All species dine in their respective atmospheric zones. Social interaction between delegations is encouraged during meal periods." Admiral Voss checked her chronometer. "We should go. Informal conversations during meals often reveal more than formal sessions." The human dining area was connected to a central social zone where different species could interact through environmental barriers. Marcus watched through transparent walls as delegates from various species ate their respective foods and engaged in what looked like casual conversation. He noticed something odd. The senior delegates from each species sat at separate tables and rarely looked at each other. But junior staff and technical advisors seemed to interact quite normally, sharing information and even what appeared to be friendly exchanges. "The hostility is only at the senior level," he observed to Admiral Voss. "I see it too," she replied. "The younger delegates look frustrated with their own senior staff." Dr. Rodriguez was watching the Silani section, where the plant beings were releasing colored chemical clouds that her tablet translated into emotional states. The Silani juniors are literally expressing disagreement with their negotiation strategy. Those yellow-green emissions indicate disapproval of their own delegation's tactics. Marcus made a decision. "I'm going to talk to some of the junior delegates." Protocol Unit 7 said social interaction was encouraged. He walked to the central interaction zone, where environmental fields allowed different species to communicate safely. A young Karathi with bright blue crystalline eyes was standing near the human section, apparently studying the interaction barriers. "Interesting technology," Marcus said, gesturing at the environmental controls. The Karathi's translator rendered his response in accented but clear English. "Yes, Human Ambassador Chen. I am Sub-Negotiator Clixus. I have studied your species' diplomatic methods, very direct compared to ours. Sometimes directness helps cut through complicated problems, Marcus replied. How do you find these negotiations? Clixus looked around nervously, then moved closer to the barrier. May I speak freely? My words will not be reported to senior delegation. You have my word. These talks frustrate many of us younger negotiators. We see possible solutions, but our seniors refuse to consider new approaches. They follow old instructions that may no longer serve our people's needs. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of old instructions? I should not say more, Clixus replied, but his crystalline eyes conveyed urgency. But perhaps you should examine who benefits when wars continue, rather than who suffers when they do. Before Marcus could ask what he meant, an older Karathi with scarred exoskeleton approached and spoke sharply in their native language. Clixus bowed his head and moved away from the interaction zone. Marcus returned to his quarters with more questions than answers. That night, he lay awake thinking about Clixus's words. Who benefits when wars continue? The obvious answer was military suppliers, weapons manufacturers, and security contractors. But in a galactic conflict involving 8 species, the web of beneficiaries would be incredibly complex. The next morning brought the formal opening of Marcus's first negotiation session. The main conference room was enormous, with sections designed for each species' environmental needs. The Karathi delegation sat in crystalline chairs that resonated with harmonic frequencies. The Solani delegation was rooted in specially prepared soil that connected them to their ship's biological network. The Draconi delegation lounged on heated stone platforms that maintained their preferred temperature. Marcus took his place at the human delegation table and listened as each senior delegate delivered opening statements that were virtually identical to statements they had made dozens of times before. The words were formal, the positions were rigid, and the tone was confrontational. But Marcus was no longer listening to the words. He was watching the body language, the timing, and the reactions. What he saw confirmed his growing suspicions. This was not a negotiation. It was a carefully choreographed performance designed to maintain the illusion of peace efforts while ensuring that no actual progress was made. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Billions of beings were dying in this war while their supposed representatives played elaborate games to avoid ending it. The question was, what could one human diplomat do about a conspiracy that spanned 8 different species and had been operating for 6 months or more? As the morning session droned on with the same meaningless exchanges, Marcus began to formulate a plan. It was risky, possibly career-ending, and would require him to abandon every rule of diplomatic protocol he had ever learned. But sometimes, he realized, the most diplomatic thing to do was to stop being diplomatic. The walk that shook the galaxy. The second day of Marcus's participation in the peace talks began with an emergency session. News had arrived that the Karathi Fourth Fleet had engaged Draconi warships near the Altair system, resulting in the destruction of 2 cruisers and a civilian transport carrying 3,000 refugees. Marcus sat in the great conference chamber watching the predictable theater unfold. The Karathi senior delegate, War Prime Thaxon, rose from his crystalline chair with carefully controlled outrage. His forearms spread wide as his translator converted his chittering speech to standard Galactic. The Draconi Federation has violated the neutral commerce accords by attacking merchant vessels in disputed space, Thaxon declared. The Karathi Empire demands immediate reparations and withdrawal of all Draconi military assets from the Altair corridor. Across the chamber, Supreme-Scale Vorak of the Draconi Federation uncoiled his massive serpentine form from the heated stone platform. His reply came in sibilant hisses that the translator rendered with ominous formality. Karathi warships fired upon Draconi exploration vessels conducting legitimate survey operations in ancestral territory. The Federation will not retreat from systems that have belonged to our people for millennia. Marcus watched the exchange with growing disgust. 3,000 civilians were dead, and these beings were arguing about territorial claims and legal precedents. But what disturbed him more was the timing. Yesterday, sub-negotiator Clixus had hinted that something was wrong with the negotiations. Today, a convenient incident provided fresh excuse for continued hostilities. Dr. Rodriguez was taking notes on her tablet, but Marcus could see her hands shaking slightly. Admiral Voss sat rigid in her chair, her military training keeping her expression neutral despite the obvious waste of life being discussed. "If I may," Marcus said, standing slowly. The massive chamber fell silent as translation systems carried his words to all 8 delegations. "Before we assign blame for this tragedy, perhaps we should examine how it could have been prevented." War Prime Thaxon's crystalline eyes focused on Marcus with what appeared to be surprise. "Human Ambassador, the prevention was simple. The Draconi should not have trespassed in Karathi space. But according to the territorial maps provided by both your governments," Marcus replied, "the Altair system is classified as disputed territory under the Galactic Commerce Framework. Neither side has exclusive claim. Supreme scale." Vorak's forked tongue flicked out in what Marcus had learned was a sign of irritation. "Human ignorance of historical claims does not negate Draconi sovereignty over systems our ancestors discovered." Marcus pulled out his tablet and activated the chamber's holographic display system. "I spent last night reviewing the territorial disputes for all 8 species represented here. Would you like to see what I found?" Without waiting for permission, he uploaded his analysis to the chamber's central computers. Holographic star charts appeared above each delegation, showing overlapping territorial claims in brilliant colors. The result was a 3-dimensional map where nearly every system in the galaxy was claimed by at least 2 species, and many were claimed by 4 or 5. "According to your various historical, ancestral, and discovery claims," Marcus continued, "every species here has legitimate right to control approximately 60% of the galaxy. The mathematical impossibility should be obvious." Murmurs rippled through the chamber as junior delegates from various species began studying the overlapping claims. Marcus noticed that many of them appeared genuinely surprised by the scope of the conflicts. The Solani senior delegate, an ancient tree being called Prime Root Thessarian, released a cloud of orange chemicals that Marcus's translator interpreted as confusion. "Human Marcus Chen, these territorial analyses were not shared with our delegation. How did you obtain detailed claiming data from all species?" "It was all in the public archives that each of your governments submitted to justify your negotiating positions," Marcus replied. "The information was available to anyone who chose to cross-reference it." Admiral Voss was watching the alien delegates' reactions with sharp attention. Many of the senior negotiators appeared uncomfortable, but the junior staff looked fascinated by the holographic display. "This is irrelevant historical analysis," War Prime Thaxon declared. "Current military realities determine territorial control, not ancient data compilations." "You're absolutely right," Marcus said, surprising everyone. "Military realities do determine control, so let's examine those." He uploaded another set of data to the holographic display. This time, the star charts showed military deployments, fleet movements, and conflict zones over the past 6 months of negotiations. "Here's what I find interesting," Marcus continued. "During the 6 months of peace talks, military activities have actually increased rather than decreased. Fleet movements have become more aggressive, not less. Border incidents have escalated, in frequency and severity." The chamber erupted in angry voices as delegates blamed each other for the military escalation. But Marcus was watching the faces of the senior negotiators. Several of them looked distinctly uncomfortable with the direction of his analysis. Sub-negotiator Clixus raised one of his forearms in a gesture Marcus had learned indicated a request to speak. War Prime Thaxon immediately chittered something that the translators rendered as, "Junior staff will remain silent during formal sessions." Marcus felt a surge of anger. "Actually, I'd like to hear what sub-negotiator Clixus has to say. His insights yesterday were quite valuable." Thaxon's crystalline eyes flashed with what appeared to be fury, but protocol required him to allow junior delegates to speak when formally recognized by another delegation's ambassador. Clixus stood slowly, his bright blue eyes focused on Marcus rather than his own senior delegate. "Human Ambassador, you asked yesterday who benefits when wars continue. I have been researching this question." He activated his own data pad and, New information appeared on the holographic display. Financial records, corporate structures, and economic data from multiple species databases. Military production across all 8 species has increased by 400% during the current conflict, Clixus reported. Defense contractor profits have reached historical peaks. Several companies have expanded operations to include weapons sales to multiple sides of the conflict. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the financial data scrolled through the holographic displays. Company names appeared that Marcus had never heard of, but the profit margins were staggering. Supreme-scale Vorak's voice carried a dangerous edge. Sub-negotiator Clixus oversteps his authority by accessing confidential economic data. The data is public, Clixus replied calmly. Corporate financial reports required by Galactic commerce law. I simply cross-referenced military supplier contracts with negotiation timeline data. Marcus studied the financial information with growing comprehension. These profit increases coincide exactly with the extension of peace negotiations. Every time progress seemed possible in these talks, military incidents increased, which drove up demand for weapons and defense systems. Dr. Rodriguez was working frantically on her tablet, her xenopsychology training helping her analyze the behavioral patterns displayed in the financial data. Marcus, she said quietly, some of these companies have board members or major shareholders from multiple species. The same individuals profit regardless of which side wins any particular engagement. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. The war wasn't just being prolonged by incompetent diplomacy, it was being deliberately maintained by individuals who profited from the conflict itself. He looked around the great chamber at the 8 delegations, seeing them with new understanding. Some of the senior delegates appeared genuinely shocked by the financial revelations. Others looked trapped between competing loyalties. A few seemed angry that their carefully managed system had been exposed. How long? Marcus asked, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. How long have these peace negotiations been designed to fail? War Prime Thaxon rose from his crystalline chair with obvious agitation. Human accusations are becoming insulting and inappropriate for diplomatic discourse. I'm not making accusations, Marcus replied. I'm asking questions that should have been asked 6 months ago. Who benefits from continued war? Who loses from successful peace? And why are we sitting here debating territorial claims while people die to maintain someone else's profit margins? The ethereal communion delegate, a crystalline being named Prime, Resonance Cavalith, began emitting harmonic frequencies that the translators rendered as complex emotional states. When the harmonic patterns finally resolved into words, the message was clear. Prime Resonance has been detecting deception, resonance, in negotiation chamber for many rotations. Truth frequency from human Marcus Chen matches pattern honesty readings. The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates from different species began demanding explanations, denying involvement, and accusing each other of deception. Marcus watched the carefully controlled diplomatic theater dissolve into genuine emotional responses for the first time since his arrival. But he also noticed something else. Several junior delegates were gathering near their respective environmental barriers, sharing information and data through translation systems. They were collaborating across species lines in ways their senior representatives had never attempted. Admiral, Voss leaned close to Marcus's ear. Whatever you're planning to do next, you need to do it now. This situation is about to spiral completely out of control. Marcus looked around the great chamber one more time. At the senior delegates who were either corrupt conspirators or pawns in someone else's game. At the junior staff who seemed genuinely committed to finding solutions. At the holographic displays showing the scope of a war that had claimed billions of lives to generate profits for a few individuals. He made his decision. Marcus Chen stood slowly and gathered his papers from the human delegation table. The simple action somehow drew attention from the chaos surrounding him, and voices began to quiet his alien eyes, sensors, and consciousness fields focused on his movements. The Terran Federation withdraws from these negotiations, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the environmental systems cycling air through different atmospheric zones. Human ambassador, War Prime Thaxon said carefully. Withdrawal from peace negotiations is not diplomatic protocol during active sessions. Neither is participating in fraud while people die, Marcus replied. He tucked his papers under his arm and looked around the chamber one final time. We were brought here to legitimize this process, to provide the appearance of serious peace efforts while the real business of war continued. We refuse to be part of that deception any longer. Supreme Scale Vorak uncoiled his full length from the stone platform, his massive form radiating menace. Human withdrawal will be interpreted as support for continued military actions against all species present. Interpret it however you choose, Marcus said, beginning to walk toward the chamber's exit. We're done pretending that this is anything other than a business meeting disguised as diplomacy. Behind him, Dr. Rodriguez and Admiral Voss gathered their materials and followed. Their footsteps echoed through the vast space as they moved toward Doi, the main corridor. Marcus had taken perhaps 20 steps when sub-negotiator Clixus called out, "Human ambassador, wait." He turned to see the young Karathi standing at his delegation table, his forearms spread in a gesture of respect. If humans withdraw because negotiations are false, what should beings do who seek true peace? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus looked back at the chamber, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. 8 species trapped in artificial conflicts, junior delegates frustrated by their seniors' intransigence, and a few individuals making fortunes from the suffering of billions. Find others who want real solutions instead of profitable problems, Marcus said. Work with them directly. Bypass the people who benefit from keeping you at war. What happened next surprised everyone, including Marcus. Sub-negotiator Clixus stepped away from the Karathi delegation table and began walking toward the chamber exit. Within moments, junior delegates from the Solani Collective, the Ethereal Communion, and 3 other species were following. War Prime Thaxon's chittering reached dangerous frequencies as his translator struggled to render his fury into standard Galactic. But his anger was drowned out by Prime Resonance Cavalith's harmonic patterns, which the translators rendered as, "Truth-seeking delegates will continue peace work with honest frequency participants." By the time Marcus reached the corridor outside the Great Chamber, he was leading an impromptu delegation of junior negotiators from 6 different species. They followed him to the central social area, where environmental barriers allowed all of them to communicate safely. "What happens now?" asked a young Solani whose chemical emissions indicated hope mixed with uncertainty. Marcus looked around at the group of beings who had chosen truth over protocol, solutions over profit. "Now, we try to do what we came here to do. Make peace." The real negotiations began that day in the social areas and environmental transition zones of Unity's Hope. Without senior delegates demanding impossible concessions or following scripts designed to prevent progress, the junior negotiators found common ground with surprising speed. The territorial disputes that had seemed impossible to resolve were addressed through time-sharing agreements and joint development projects. The resource conflicts were solved through trade partnerships and technology sharing. The security concerns were met through mutual defense pacts that protected all species without threatening any. Within a week, they had drafted preliminary agreements that addressed every major issue that had deadlocked the formal negotiations for 6 months. But more importantly, they had established direct communication channels between their respective governments that bypassed the individuals and corporations profiting from the conflict. Marcus received the message from Earth Command while he was reviewing the draft agreements in his quarters. The communication was brief and to the point. "Congratulations, Ambassador Chen. Your unorthodox methods have produced the first genuine progress in galactic peace negotiations in over 2 centuries. Several species governments have contacted Earth directly requesting formal treaty discussions based on your preliminary frameworks." Admiral Voss knocked on his doorframe, a rare smile on her face. "You need to see the military intelligence reports," she said. "Fleet movements have changed across all 8 species. Ships are moving away from border areas instead of toward them. Several governments have announced unilateral ceasefires pending formal treaty negotiations." Dr. Rodriguez appeared behind the Admiral, her tablet displaying news feeds from across the galaxy. "It's working, Marcus. Real peace negotiations are starting on 6 different worlds simultaneously. The junior delegates we worked with have been promoted to senior positions. Their governments are taking the agreement seriously. Marcus looked out his window at the stars, thinking about the simple decision that had changed everything. Walking away from a corrupt system had exposed its true nature and allowed genuine solutions to emerge. 3 months later, he stood in the same great chamber where he had walked away from the false peace negotiations. But this time the room was filled with new faces, honest delegates, and the sounds of productive discussion rather than scripted theater. The final peace accords were signed by all 8 species, establishing the foundation for what historians would later call the Galactic Renaissance. The agreements included provisions for joint exploration, shared technology development, cultural, exchange programs, and economic partnerships that benefited all participants. As Marcus watched the signing ceremony, sub-negotiator Clixus approached the environmental barrier near the human section. "Human ambassador," he said, "my species has a saying. Sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to leave. Thank you for teaching us that wisdom." Marcus smiled, remembering his walk across the chamber floor that had felt like the longest journey of his career. Sometimes the most diplomatic thing to do is stop being diplomatic. The young Karathi's crystalline eyes flashed with what Marcus had learned was their equivalent of laughter. "We will remember that lesson." And they did. The Chen Doctrine, as it came to be known, became a standard part of diplomatic training across all species. When negotiations become performance art designed to prevent solutions, the most effective response is to stop performing and start solving. The Galactic War officially ended not with a grand treaty ceremony, but with a human diplomat who decided to gather his papers and walk away from a lie. Sometimes the most powerful word in any language is simply no.